Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm thrilled as always to be here with you. Paul, always good to have you here as well, sir.
Oh, David, it's great to be back, and I'm really excited for the episode today.
Yeah, look, it's one that's a little bit different, and as you'll hear in the introduction, I've sort of followed the work of Dan Spiffy Neuman for a number of years. I can't even tell you how I stumbled across him. But as you'll hear, Dan plays organ, and also a bit of piano and synth in this amazing church called Greater Mt Sinai in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And again, I can't remember how I got onto him, but just the first video I saw of his, where he literally positions his camera right there, and you get to see what he does during a church service. Just from a logistics and a pulling back the curtain viewpoint, fascinated me. And it's both that, his actual quality of playing, and one thing I didn't mention during the interview, Paul, but he is a stylish guy. As you'll see on the videos he puts up on YouTube, I love the fact that he wears this wonderful, stylish clothing. His glasses match. He looks the part. You can tell that not only is he passionate about the music, but he's also passionate about the whole way that it's presented, and you can tell that come through in this interview. So, Paul, bit of a fanboy, but a fanboy for something a little bit different.
Yeah, well, his nickname is Spiffy, so that gives you an indication
so.
of the way he presents himself. But you'll hear David and I both mention during the interview to you guys, please do yourself a favour and check out the YouTubes. And look, I'll put my hand up, and I think I speak for David as well. I'm far from an expert on Pentecostal churches and worship music, and definitely not an expert on black churches in America. Trust me, it doesn't matter. It's so interesting to watch him play. It's brilliant music, and if you are familiar with that stuff, brilliant, because you'll see it done at a really high level and some really interesting insights too. So yeah, it was a lot of fun doing this interview.
No, absolutely. So we'll just jump into the show and we'll speak to you after the interview. Dan, wonderful to have you on the show, sir. Can't thank you enough for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me.
I have to say, Dan, I've been a fan of yours for probably, I'm going to say, coming up to 5 years, at least 3 or 4 years, and probably like a lot of people that discovered your work was probably during lockdown, although I first stumbled across the great videos that you do of your role with the Greater Mt Sinai Church of God in Christ. And you just blew me away from the first video I saw. I just love the way you approach playing and the fact that we got a little bit of an inside look into how intensive the work you do in the context of one of those church services. So I thought, if you don't mind, we might start there. That was a very long-winded way of saying, how did you first get the job with Greater Mt Sinai, understanding that that's one of many roles you play as far as church?
Well, that was kind of circuitous for me. I've been active in church my whole life. My mom was one of the music directors and choir directors at her Lutheran church growing up. And then in middle school, I got involved with gospel music in black churches, in part through my godmother, and in part through a community organization that I was a part of that we'll probably touch on at some point during this interview. So I already had a lot of background in gospel music, and in particularly the denomination that church is in, the Church of God in Christ, which is arguably the most famous black church denomination, especially when it comes to music. The Clark sisters famously, and a lot of other famous gospel artists originated in the Church of God in Christ. But as for how I got the job at that particular church, I was already familiar with that church because one of the churches I was playing for in Madison, the pastor of that church, his uncle was the pastor of Greater Mt Sinai, and then also a gospel choir that I'd recorded with multiple times had their CD release concert at Greater Mt Sinai. So I was familiar with the church. But then there's a sound engineer that I'd known and worked with for at least 20 years, owner of the largest black-owned sound company in the state of Wisconsin. He also serves Northern Illinois. Kendrick Scales of Scales Pro Audio. who's one of my favorite people and a true character, and definitely somebody you should talk to if you ever touch on the sound and engineering aspect of it. He's I think a character is the best way to sum it up, but he's very knowledgeable. He'd put a post on Facebook saying he knew a church in Milwaukee that was looking for a musician. And I normally ignore those posts. It would take a lot more to go into why, but just basically I don't generally watch for that kind of thing, and I don't generally take it seriously. And something told me to reach out to him and find out more. And I did, and found out I was familiar with the church. And again, normally I would not have taken a job. I was active at the church that was pastored by the family member of the pastor of Mount Sinai. And I said, normally I would never leave one church to go work for another. But something told me to go. And so I went and spoke to the pastor of the church that I was helping here in Madison and said, how do you feel about me taking this job for your uncle? And he gave me his blessing, went through the interview process with them. And a funny story, probably the largest church in my hometown of Madison, Wisconsin, which is a cross-cultural church with both black and white pastoral staff, and they were trying to integrate their music department, and they hired a friend of mine that's a gospel artist as one of their assistant pastors, and he was going to be starting a black gospel church under that umbrella. And ironically, he was going to bring me as a white guy in on staff to that church, but that wasn't going to happen for at least 6 months. So my first contract with Greater Mt Sinai, or GMS, was supposed to be a 6-month contract, and then I was going to take that job that was a little closer to home, and ended up loving it at Greater Mt Sinai, and I've been there 5 years.
Wow, 5 years. There you go. And so I'm going to encourage our listeners and viewers, and we'll have links to some of your work at I'll say GMS from now, at GMS to check it out before we continue the conversation, because I'm going to ask some questions that have just fascinated me watching those videos. So first one being, Dan, it is an enormous church. It's such a lovely looking church, and it has such a great atmosphere to it. Is that a relatively large church compared to some?
Short answer is yes. So a lot of it depends on the population of the city, the demographics of the city, and then, of course, you obviously find a lot more in the Bible Belt, down south. So for Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is the largest city in Wisconsin, and also the city with the highest black population, and also the most segregated city in North America, I believe. It is the third or fourth largest black church. So there are definitely some churches larger than us, but there are thousands of churches. So we're near the top. Madison, my hometown, which is about half the size of Milwaukee and has a significantly smaller black population, has some larger churches, but no predominantly black churches that are as big as GMS. And then if you go to Chicago, which is 2 hours south of me, which is a bigger city than Milwaukee, I'm sure there are dozens of churches at least the size of GMS or bigger. Another thing to consider too is, do you count membership rolls on the roster? Do you count Sunday attendance? And if you count Sunday attendance, do you count people that are watching virtually? Because one thing about GMS is before the pandemic, we had the sanctuary pretty full, and it's been gradually filling back up. But a lot of people are opting to stay home and watch on streaming instead. So that we're definitely not as full on Sundays. But depending on how you count the numbers, I'm definitely an advocate of people of streaming. But I also think that if you can come in person, then you should, both as far as a church service or a concert or anything with music and live entertainment.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm going to ask you about the order of service and your approach to those services because I'm fascinated by that as well. The last non-musical observation from looking at those videos, you've mentioned already that there's a great deal of segregation. I assume, aside from wider societal issues, I assume you mean that in regards to churches and who goes to what church, there's still some degree of segregation? Because it's obvious from those videos, it is a predominantly black church, and I'm guessing, Dan, in some services you're either the only or one of only a very small number of white guys there.
Yeah. So there's two things at play, at least with GMS. One is there's an old saying that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the country. And it's very uncommon to find a church that has an equal number of different cultures, not even just black and white. There are Hispanic churches, there are Asian churches, even just within Christianity, pretty much the whole diaspora is covered. And also, I mean, keeping in mind the population of your city as well as the population of your neighborhood, churches are very communal. So, like, even having the population reflect the population of the city is rare. Like, so Madison, I think, is I want to say 9% black. But if you go to a church on Sunday morning, it's either going to have less than 9% black people or more. It's very rare. It's very rarely going to reflect the population. Other thing that I talked about was Milwaukee being the most segregated city. I believe it's in North America. It might just be above the Mason-Dixon line, but definitely the most segregated city in the North. And that's because of redlining. Do you guys know what that is?
No.
It's basically when they came to build the interstate highways, they did it in such a way that destroyed black communities and forced black people into less desirable neighborhoods, and just basically encouraged segregation, with poverty also being a factor, forcing the black people into the poorer areas and so on and so forth. And Milwaukee was one of the victims of redlining, so it is very, very segregated. The north side is predominantly black. The south side is predominantly Hispanic, and then the suburbs are predominantly white. And GMS is located in the heart of the north side of Milwaukee. So just driving around there, you won't see a lot of white people, much less, visiting a neighborhood church. And speaking as a white guy who's existed in black environments for pretty much my whole life, for an area like that, I appreciate that, because I feel like there needs to be a safe space. I definitely think that predominantly white churches that exist in areas with some, non-white people need to do a better job of reaching out and including other cultures. But I don't think that the onus should fall on black churches to involve more white people. Certainly, if you guys visited my church, you'd be welcomed with open arms, and as are, any of the people of different cultures that show up. But I do think it is important that that gospel music and black church is an area that hasn't been gentrified. White people haven't discovered it yet, and made it something of theirs.
Couldn't agree more, and I think you're absolutely right. I have no doubt that both you were welcome and that anyone else would be welcomed, because that's certainly the atmosphere that projects from the videos that you've posted. So on to that, the other thing musically that stands out for me is, quite rightly, you're front and center because you're recording the video.
Yeah.
But you're part of, obviously, from what I can tell, there's yourself and usually someone on drums, and then obviously the amazing vocal work occurring, whether it's the preacher or the singers or so on. Just tell us about an average service for you and the preparation you need to do to get ready for that.
Okay, so I'll clarify that at some times over the course of the 5 years I've been there, that the only musician has been myself and a drummer, usually Eric Stewart, who's our regular drummer, who's absolutely phenomenal. And then there's supposed to be a keyboard player, and right now our keyboard player, Justin Baskin, is also our minister of music. So he's often up leading songs or directing the choir, in which case the band is primarily organ and drums. For the past 2 or so years that he's been there, anything where he's not up, he's also on keyboard. And I tried to hire some other keyboard players in the past, and they didn't work out as well as I'd hoped. We have had some bass players come in and out as well, and we had a guitar player for a period. So as far as preparation goes, so my official title there is organist, assistant minister of music, and music director. So the minister of music is over the whole music department, singers, band, the music department umbrella, and the music director is specifically over the band and the instruments. And so I am second in command of the whole music department, and then specifically over the band, and then of course I'm also the organist. And so Justin, being the minister of music, is primarily responsible for music selection, with me also being involved, and also anyone else who directs or leads worship also being involved. So sometimes I'll just get a list of songs from him at the start of the week. This is what we're doing this week. It'd be rare for me to object. I might object if I have a reason to, but most of the time he's very good with selection, so I would have no real reason to. Sometimes it might be more collaborative. Under the minister music before him, it was a bit more collaborative where she needed more input. But in this case, he definitely is very good at picking the right music. And so more or less, either I'll get a list from him or I'll get a question from him. Hey, do you have any suggestions for this week? And we send the music out. Him and I both are responsible for sending the music out to the various vocalists and choir members, musicians, etc. We try to get it out by Monday night. And then I personally have Monday and Tuesday to find some time in my schedule if there's any music that I don't know to sit down and learn it. Sometimes it's all songs I already know and I've played before, and I can just show up. Our rehearsals are at Wednesdays. I can show up on Wednesday and have everything ready. And I like to make sure that I know not just what I need to play, but I like to make sure that I know everything else about it just in case there's a gap. Justin's usually teaching the parts. I've done some teaching in the past, but I don't have to with him. But I like to make sure I know the basics of the parts just in case. And I like to make sure I know things like the BPM and whatever else, anything specific that I'm looking for from Eric. If we have any other musicians joining us that week, their parts, etc. So if I don't know the music, because sometimes Justin will pull out some stuff that I've never heard before, I'll listen to it and I'll say, okay, can I remember this just by listening to it, or do I need to do more? If it's not something I can trust myself to remember, again, not just what I need to do, but the basis of the song enough to help everybody else, just from listening to it, then I will sit down and I will take notes. And I will write out the notes to a specific song in my email that I can reference. I open up my email and reference it during rehearsal on Wednesdays, and that is usually enough for me, because the process of writing notes is usually enough for me to be able to retain. And then our rehearsal is Wednesdays, and we usually rehearse for about 2 hours with everybody together. One of the things that I'm very proud of, well, let me backtrack just a little bit, because there's usually 4 songs sent out for a service. 2 praise and worship songs, 2 choir selections. And right now, post-COVID, with not as many singers and things coming back to in-person, generally speaking, the praise team and the choir is the same people, but a different style of music, as opposed to before, when it used to be the praise team was a smaller group of singers and the choir was a much larger group of singers. But every service has 2 prepared praise and worship songs and 2 prepared choir selections, and those are what we send in the email. Anything else that happens in service is spontaneous, and there's a lot of spontaneity in Pentecostal churches and predominantly black churches, and a lot of it is stuff that you're just kind of expected to know, because somebody will just start singing a hymn out of nowhere, and you're expected to know that hymn. And usually it's not a specific musical part of the service. It'll be like somebody's praying and they want to include that hymn in their prayer. Or, and the thing that's interesting about a church like GMS that's not a small church is we have to make sure we balance preparedness with the spontaneity that's a part of the culture, because with at that large of a scale, nobody wants to look unprepared. Nobody wants to look disorganized. And there's a lot of smaller churches that don't do any preparation at all. You just show up and sing, show up and play. Hopefully you know the songs. And if you don't, oh, well, there's 50 people here. When I came to GMS, their previous minister music had left. All but one of their previous musicians had left. They were kind of in a bad spot as far as their music department. They were looking for somebody urgently because they had services coming up, and they didn't want to be without. The great thing about that is, in some ways, I had a clean slate, and the thing that was important to me was to institute some structure that wasn't there when I got there, in terms of we're going to pick the songs. We're not going to deviate from these songs as far as the pre-prepared songs. We're going to prepare them. Everybody's going to have the information. Everybody's going to have the key, the BPM, the lyrics if necessary, because, again, in some churches, there's a history of we'll just show up and let God do the rest. And then some churches over prepare, and there's absolutely no room for any spontaneity whatsoever. In church lingo, they would call that the Spirit moving, the Spirit coming in and moving. And one of the things that was important to me was to make sure that we had that basic structure, because when you have basic structure, you can improvise on top of the basic structure, and it will continue to make sense and not fall apart and not be a train wreck. But you got to have some basic structure. So that was one of the things that I set in place when I first got there. And then the other thing that I was getting at that I put in place that was really important to me is I wanted to look forward to rehearsals. I don't know how much playing out you guys do and how many things you do that involve frequent rehearsals, but I'm pretty certain that if you are a musician, you've been involved at something at some point that you dreaded going to rehearsals. Either it's because it was a waste of your time, it was unproductive, nobody showed up knowing anything, or people were taking it so seriously, attitudes were terrible. It was just not fun for one reason or another, and or would go on way too long. You'd have a 5-hour rehearsal for something that could have been accomplished in an hour. And so one of the things that I put in place with the previous minister of music that has remained in place with Justin coming on board is that our rehearsals, they're strict enough to make sure we get done what we need to get done, but they're never so strict that they're not fun. The expectation is that you come prepared. The expectation is that it's enjoyable. If somebody makes a mistake in rehearsal, it's okay. That's what rehearsal is for. Even if I make a mistake, I need to stop and listen to the song. I forgot that chord change. It's okay. There's no pressure other than that you just simply do prepare yourself to the best of your ability, show up to rehearsal willing to work with a positive attitude. And rehearsals are the highlight of my week. That's exactly how they have been, and I can't stress how important that is, to have rehearsals that are enjoyable, productive, and not overly long. And then unless we have a special service, that's it until Sunday. Sometimes we will have services on a Thursday or a Friday or a Saturday, depending on if it's a special event. We will have like a Friday night service sometimes. Sometimes there's weddings, funerals, things of that nature. But on a week with nothing else, I just have from Wednesday to Sunday, I can relax and I can worry about other things and do other gigs, and again, unless we have things going on at the church. And I show up Sunday morning, and I'm a big advocate of preparedness. So I make sure I always get up earlier than I need to in case something goes wrong. Get to the church earlier than I need to in case something goes wrong. Listen to the music on the way just in case I forgot something. And then you just never know. That's one of the reasons why I record every service that I do, because as much as we prepare and as much structure as there it is, somebody will occasionally, most commonly, it'll be the senior pastor during something like an altar call, will sing a song that no one's heard since 1972, or he'll like pull one of us aside and say, "Can y'all do this song?" And so I make sure I record it, because those moments, which don't always make it to YouTube, I want to make sure I go back and learn whatever it was that I wasn't prepared for, and that way I'll know it the next time it gets called. And then, like I said, our band is very collaborative, because two of the three core members are on the music leadership staff, and then Eric is just phenomenal. We have, we consider Scales is our sound engineer. We consider him part of the band as well, because having good sound is key and crucial when you're, doing something at church or a facility of that size, and if you're streaming. And then, Sundays after church, I go get coffee, I go get lunch. Assuming I don't have any gigs or any other work Sunday evening, I go home and I take the longest nap of the week, and then everything starts over again on Mondays.
That's right. That's a brilliant overview, Dan, and we're definitely going to talk about the production side, because that's incredible to watch as well. But you just raised a great point about structure versus improvisation, and it still blows my mind, as I said, how spontaneous it appears. And you mentioned there are sections in the lead up to perhaps some prayer. The preacher may be doing some stuff, and you're doing these beautiful little vamps on the organ or whatever, helping to build that atmosphere and emotion. And I assume that's just come from years of experience of really getting the feel of how a service runs.
So, I mean, if you watch my videos, again, I pretty much put the whole service on YouTube in increments. I might edit out some quiet moments or something like that. And then also our church stream is available on YouTube as well. You can watch the whole service in its entirety. Honestly, I believe that my videos sound better than the stream, and that's not because of the lack of our engineer, but because of a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, among a lot of people where they're, I can't, because you'll get people in the comments on the stream, we can't hear the words, turn the backgrounds up, and then you end up with the background vocals louder. It's, anyhow. But you can literally look at the order of our service, and I can tell you what's improvised and what's not, because again, we have structure to improvise around. And so we start out with something called Call to Worship, which is literally what it sounds like. Service is going to start, everybody get here. And that's not rehearsed or prepared, but it's generally a song that we know. It's generally a hymn or a traditional song. Justin or I will pick one of the singers and say, will you do Call to Worship today? They'll pick a hymn or something like that and say, I'm going to do, Blessed Assurance. And I'll find their key on the organ maybe 5 minutes before. Oh, they're in F sharp. Okay. And that's all done like 5 minutes before service. So it's not rehearsed, but it's not completely unprepared either. We know what's going to happen. Call to worship, then a prayer, then praise and worship, which is usually 2 songs that are usually rehearsed and prepared. Then after that is the intercessory prayer, which is basically a communal prayer for people that aren't there. How can we intercede for others? That is not rehearsed. That is completely spontaneous. If there's a song in that, it's usually completely spontaneous. Then the first choir selection, which is rehearsed. Then offering, which sometimes we'll do a song for offering, and if that's very rarely rehearsed. That's usually me or Justin saying, what should we do for offering today? This one, go. Then church announcements, and we have our church welcome song, which is not rehearsed, but we all know it. And then a sermonic selection from either the choir or soloist, and that's rehearsed. And then the sermon, which obviously is not rehearsed. And then any music that comes after the sermon is not rehearsed. Usually there'll be either an altar call or a praise break after the sermon. And then benediction, our pastor likes to do a variation of Like the Dew for our closing song, which again is not rehearsed, but we all know it. And then interspersed throughout the service are praise breaks. I don't know if you guys or your listeners know what they are. It's a church tradition of, like the Blues Brothers church scene, just shouting and dancing and clapping to a very specific type and tempo of music that is intended to be spontaneous, and it's supposed to be spontaneous. And there's certain places in our service where they will usually fall, but it depends on the energy of the congregation. If the people just aren't getting with it, we're not going to do it there this Sunday. And if the whole congregation is excited, then it can happen at any point during the service. And Justin is very much a lover of praise breaks, so I very much listen to him and any ideas that he might have. I have some that I traditionally love and do myself, but for the most part, it's whatever comes spontaneously in that moment, and we'll communicate with each other. That usually falls, if the intercessory prayer is particularly moving, it will fall after the intercessory prayer. On a rare occasion, if praise and worship is particularly moving, it'll come after praise and worship. And then almost always after the sermon, because our senior pastor, Victor Davis, loves to end his sermons with a praise break. So those are where you can generally look for that. But again, we might go over some ideas for praise breaks after rehearsal, like as a band rehearsal, but it's intended to be spontaneous. So you can, like I said, you can watch the videos and specifically tell from the order of things what songs were spontaneous and what songs were not.
Thank you for that insight, Dan. And that would be a great companion for anyone watching your videos, because I must say, David and I, when we were watching your recordings, and please, listeners and viewers, check them out. They're really amazing on YouTube. That's what we were scratching our head about. Was, is this rehearsed, or is it improvised, or because it just seems to flow together so well. And so that's my feedback. It just seems to be so seamless and works really well. And as David said, the way the organ playing sort of matches the emotion and the rise and fall of what's going on in the service is really wonderful to check out. And on that subject, I'm really interested, Dan, in the sort of feedback you might have had on the changes that you've implemented since you've been there. So, what's the feedback been from your colleagues on stage, from Justin, from the pastors, from the congregation? Have you really noticed a positive response to the things you've put in place for the church?
I mean, short answer would be yes. Slightly longer, but still short answer would be sometimes no feedback is good feedback. Just to clarify, Justin wasn't there for, I think, my first. Justin had actually been a member of the church years ago, and he'd left to go to another church, and then he came back at some point post COVID. I don't remember exactly when. I think he's been there for something like 2 years now. And our previous minister of music, who I was who I had voted in at the time, Janetti, was also phenomenal. And she was also a huge part of implementing the structure and other things that we did that really helped. In general, I've gotten a lot of things have really improved since you've been here. No real specific, but again, the thing about, and maybe I don't know if this is a Midwestern work ethic thing or what. The way that I was brought up and the way that I'm used to is when people have people that you report to, your leaders have specific criticism, they'll give it to you. Other than that, they stay out of the way and they let you do it. And so we're pretty much the only feedback that I'm used to is the critical feedback. I want this differently. I want you to start doing, this kind of song or that kind of thing or whatever. For the most part, it's been very good. And like I said, I think there's definitely been a lot of positive feedback as far as the church in general since I've been there, which is definitely a really good sign, specifically to what we're doing, because we're a very music-centric church. Music is probably 75% of the service, which isn't necessarily the case at all churches, even in my denomination, much less black churches or Pentecostal churches as well. We are a church that is very heavy on music and less heavy on talking. And so the fact that we've gotten a lot of positive feedback overall for the church, I think, is very telling that the music department has also been a key part of that.
That's a great point, Dan. And so probably the last question about GMS is the actual setup you have there. So, I mean, again, for being an avid watcher of your videos for a number of years, your key instrument is the organ with the beautiful Leslie speaker there behind you, and then you have, from memory, an electric piano and a synth sitting on top. Just tell us about what the setup is and how you use that across what you do.
So, obviously, you have a Hammond organ and Leslie speaker, which is key to any Black Pentecostal church, particularly the Church of God in Christ. It's pretty amazing that you can walk into almost any black church in America and see a Hammond organ of one variety or another. That they're still using this instrument that was invented in 100 years ago, and other than the new digital versions, there's not much. I mean, most of the organs that churches are using, they stopped making in the 70s, so it's pretty amazing that they're still being used today. Some churches, some more contemporary and modern churches, are getting away from organs and more into pianos and string samples and things of that nature. But if you're at a Pentecostal church that likes to shout and have a preacher that likes accompaniment while he's preaching, organ is key. And I fell in love with the organ at a very young age, and so I wouldn't have it any other way. I've been at some of those more contemporary churches that were more guitar heavy and more keyboard, piano heavy, and I missed the organ. So absolutely. Again, depending on which videos you've seen, we've moved things around a little bit, but Justin is just off screen in the more recent videos. He sits immediately to my right, which is nice because him and I can communicate very easily. And he has a Yamaha motif, workstation, which he can do, grand piano sounds, electric piano sounds, strings, synth, brass, pretty much any other sound that's common in gospel music. I have a Fender Rhodes piano to my left for a couple reasons. Most, core reason being I love the Fender Rhodes piano, and I've loved it pretty much my whole life since I think Blues Brothers was the first time I really paid attention to it. Either it's hard to say Blues Brothers, Stevie Wonder, or there's one other album that's just escaping me, Herbie Hancock, Headhunters. Some early core memory was unlocked by the Fender Rhodes piano, and I saved up my money in high school and got my first one. And actually, there was a church that I was playing for before I came to GMS, not the one I mentioned before, a different one. That had an organ, and they weren't really used to the organ, so they said, well, what else can you play that's not the organ. And the thing about it is I'm an organist. I'm an organist and a guitar player. I don't consider myself a keyboard player. And if you know anything about organ versus keyboard, you know that among other differences, the way you shape your chords is different because the timbre of the instrument is different. So I could play the same chord on organ and the same chord on keyboard, and it's not going to sound right on both. But the Fender Rhodes has a tone that's close enough to the tone of the organ that if I can play my organ chords on the Fender Rhodes, it'll still sound good. And so I bought a Fender Rhodes specifically to use at that last church. And then I brought it with me to GMS, and I love it. And for the most part, they love it as well. Also, I did get the idea. I never would have thought of Fender Rhodes in church, but for years, Bennett Pasinger at City of Refuge, which is one of the biggest churches probably in the U.S., definitely one of the biggest churches in Los Angeles. And for the longest, they had the best church band in the country, I think. And Bennett Pasinger had a motif or some other workstation, and then a Rhodes right here. And I was like, Rhodes in church. Why didn't I think of that? And then the synthesizer that sits on top of it is just an old Korg Triton, and that's because when we don't have a bass player, I play key bass, sometimes on the organ, but sometimes I like a bass patch. And without spending a ton of money, I have yet to find a better bass patch than the old Korg Triton. I'm sure it exists, but again, I'm not trying to spend thousands of dollars on something I just use for one patch. So you can get a used Triton for $500, and that dark R&B bass is unmatched. So that's core to me. I'm a lover of vintage keyboards. So I have a clavinet, and I wish I could figure out a way to work it in there somehow. But that's the core for me, is the organ, the Rhodes, and something to play key bass on when I'm not playing organ bass.
Yeah, thank you for that insight into your instruments. Absolutely fantastic. Tell us, Dan, about your formative years, and you mentioned your mother's link to the music and to the church, and obviously it's an environment that you grew up in. But really interested in when for you the idea of playing music started to become a thing, and then how that developed as you grew up, and how that developed into the musician that you are now.
So I was very blessed to grow up in a music household, because my mom was active in the music department of her church, which is Lutheran church. She was also a public school teacher and sometimes would teach music. And then she would come home from teaching public schools and teach piano out of her house from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. every night. So there was always piano music in the house, always piano students in and out of the house, and that was just part of the childhood. Interestingly enough, I don't think I got my love of music from her, and I definitely didn't get my ear from her, because my dad actually was probably the bigger music lover of the two, and he definitely had the better ear. My mom could not play by ear. You put anything in front of her, she could play it, but she couldn't play by ear. My dad, on the other hand, had a great ear, didn't play an instrument, but my dad was the classic dad you hear about from that era. He was born in 1950, that had the record collection. And anytime that he had the kids, especially if mom wasn't home so he could turn the music up real loud, he'd get out his record collection and play us everything from James Brown to the Beatles to Jim Croce to Beach Boys, Al Green, Bob Marley, Stevie Wonder. And some of my happiest childhood memories were my dad pulling a record out of his record collection and putting it on, and have that old vintage Pioneer stereo and just cranking it up, and we would just all dance in the living room. And I saw in the email that you sent me that one of the questions you sometimes ask your guests is formula of albums. And I don't remember if there was a quantitative number, but two that I wanted to include in that is, so I was born 3 months premature, so I was in the hospital for a very long time after I was born. When my dad finally got to bring his firstborn son home, he was so happy that he played Prince's, I believe, 1999, whatever album came out in 1984, and Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. He played those albums back to back to back for his newborn son. So while I don't know that I wouldn't pick Bruce Springsteen as one of my most influential artists, and while I would pick Prince, I don't think that's the album I would pick. Those albums definitely influenced my love of music and my childhood, because how could they not? He, like I said, he just would play those were the two albums that came out the same week or so that I came home from the hospital, and he just played them nonstop. The other two kind of subliminal childhood influences that I didn't realize until I became an adult, besides the stuff that my dad played, was Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. For you or for any of your listeners that have never sat down and listened to Johnny Costa play piano on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it is incredible. He recorded every episode live and never played the theme song the same way twice. If you go on YouTube,
Wow.
you can look up several different intros to Mr. Rogers, and every time Johnny Costa played something different. I never thought about that influencing my love of music, but listening back, it had to, because I'd never missed Mr. Rogers, and that might have been why. Other thing was Vince Guaraldi, Peanuts Christmas Special. And for that matter, any of the Peanuts specials, the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and all of those, just the complexities in that music, in these television programs that were geared towards children, I really feel like it did something to my brain, something very positive to my brain early on, and unlocked a certain core memories with music.
So, from that early childhood, then moving on into adolescent years and to becoming a musician, what was the journey there for you?
So I was always the kid with tennis rackets jumping around the house. I wanted to play guitar. I don't really know what it was about the guitar that caught me, because my mom wanted me to play piano. I had no interest in playing piano. So I saved up and I bought my first guitar, and it was everything I dreamed of, but it was, like basically a toy guitar. So then I saved up and bought a nicer guitar, and then I put on little concerts in my elementary school, and I'd get other kids that played instruments to come join me, and they'd have the whole school come into the gym for an assembly so we could play our instruments and sing our songs. And then at some point I saved up because I wanted an electric guitar. Same thing. That was what caught me. And it was a battle with my mom my whole childhood, because she wanted me to take piano lessons. I took them from her as much as we both could stand, and it never really captured my interest. Obviously, I learned enough of the basics that I could then go on and do other things, but at the time I didn't think I was learning anything. I was very focused on guitar. And then I'll backtrack a little bit, because I know going to church with my mom and going to church with my grandparents, both of those churches had beautiful, just, industry standard historic pipe organs. And I remembered being fascinated by the pipe organs and thinking they were just so beautiful. I never had an interest in playing it, but I just remembered loving it and looking at the pipes and wanting to know how it all worked, and certain stops did this, and it just fascinated me. So I think the next core memory for me when it comes to my music journey, my dad and my friend's dad had taken us to an event in the park. This probably would have been 4th or 5th grade. I had a little band. I was playing guitar, and there were other, kid 4th or 5th graders in the band. And there was an event that was jazz in the park. And the headliner for this event was Clyde Stubblefield, who, if you guys have heard of, that was James Brown's drummer for many, many years. Originated many of the drum beats that are standard in funk music, as well as, I think, the most sampled drummer in history.
That's right. Yeah.
But he lived in my hometown in Madison, Wisconsin, and so you would just see Clyde around town playing at bar gigs and playing wherever, because he was a musician trying to make a living like everybody else. And he had his blues cover band as the headliner for this jazz fest, and they were just doing bar band songs, Mustang Sally, and that kind of Al Green, that kind of stuff. And I loved it, because I didn't have a chance to be sick of those songs yet. And a lot of them were the same songs my dad played. But me and my friend kept noticing there was something spinning on stage. And what's that spinning thing? Why do they have something spinning on stage? And then every so often it would speed up and slow down. And we realized that kind of correlated with the sound of the organ or keyboard or wherever he was playing. And so I went and snuck up around it behind stage when they took a break. I said, "That's a spinning speaker." And I thought that was super fascinating. And so the next thing I did is I got our little toy keyboard, because we had a upright piano for my mom to teach on. Then we had like a little toy Yamaha or Casio keyboard down in the basement so we could practice music when she was upstairs teaching. I took the little Casio keyboard and I hooked it to a boombox, and then I got a ceiling fan motor and a piece of cardboard, and I put that in the boombox, and I put the little Yamaha keyboard to an organ patch. And I figured out how to make my own organ with the spinning speaker there. And that was kind of the first thing that got me involved in being interested in Hammond organ and in playing the organ. And so I still didn't consider myself a keyboard player, or obviously an organist. But then when I got to 6th grade, I wanted to join the jazz band. And they said, well, we don't have a jazz band at this school. And I was so disappointed. And they said, well, there's a community organization that rehearses here called Arts Are Prevention. They have a band. Maybe you can join that. And so I went and showed up to when Arts Are Prevention was rehearsing. And that was just a community organization. The methodology was keeping kids off the street by getting them involved in music and the arts and theater and drama and everything like that. Great organization. At the time, the school I was going to was predominantly non-white and predominantly, lower middle class and poor people. It was, where an organization like that was be very helpful. And I showed up to the rehearsal, and they said, well, what do you play? I said, I play guitar. They said, we already have a guitar player. Can you play keyboards? We don't have a keyboard player. I said, I can try. And they sat me down in front of a little keyboard, and I turned on the organ patch, and that was my first experience. And then to this day, if you ask anybody, because some of the people in that organization are my friends, and I consider them family to this day. If you ask anybody to this day, they claim that I walked in saying I'm a keyboard player, and I know for sure that's not what happened, but that's the version that they tell. And so I joined that organization, and I would go back and forth between the guitar, the keyboard, and usually I would have the keyboard on an organ patch or an electric piano patch. That was my start. And then so that we would get hired, because we turned out to be pretty good. And so we would get hired as a band to do events around southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois. So I started touring with my middle school band that was part of Arts Are Prevention. And it helped that the founder of Arts Are Prevention, Joe McLean, who was a well-respected civil rights leader who worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King, had also managed and booked bands in the 70s and 80s. So he had lots of connections. So now he's booking these kids. And we were playing a community picnic near where the University of Wisconsin is. And there were some girls from the UW Gospel Choir there. And they said, well, we need musicians for the gospel choir. These kids can play. Let's hire these kids. And so my middle school band got hired to play for the University of Wisconsin Gospel Choir. And by this point, I'd heard gospel music because I was the only white kid in Arts Are Prevention. So we'd been in a number of black churches at this point, and I'd met and connected with some other musicians and singers and people that wanted to teach me and wanted to sew into me, but I still had no real relationship with gospel music. But we got to this UW Gospel Choir a rehearsal, and all these gorgeous college girls were there. And they thought we were so cute, and we were like, well, we're gonna figure this out one way or another. We're gonna figure this out. And so, and in the process, I fell in love with gospel music. I was like, I don't know, I've never heard anything like this before. I've never played anything like this before. This is amazing. This is what I want to do. And so I then set my sights on what can I do to learn gospel music. And I started, reaching out to other people in the area. And there was a woman at a local church who had already kind of started to sew into me and started to teach me. And she adopted me as her godson. And she had been a very well-respected musician and music leader in Chicago. And so she started bringing me to some of the churches that she was involved in, both in Madison and Chicago, and bringing me around some real musicians. And I was this kid that I thought I could play. At the same time, I still knew I didn't know anything. And then the next formative thing was in 9th grade. A girl that I'd known as one of the singers in Arts Are Prevention had came up to me at high school and said, "Hey, my uncle's starting a church. Do you want to be the organist?" And I said, "I don't really know. Like I've played gospel music now before, but I don't really know how to play for a church service." It's she's like, "That's okay. His brothers are all musicians. They'll teach you." And that was the first church that I ever joined, besides the church that my mom, the Lutheran church that my mom is I believe still at to this day. And so that kind of started my career in playing for churches. And the other thing that happened to me around the same time, I was probably 15 or 16, was one of the local musicians. And again, I can't stress how much that anytime that there was singers or musicians in the area that ran into me at this church and this event, they said, "Oh, this kid's got some potential. Let me bring him around some other people. Let me show him some things that are better, some ways that he can get better," so on and so forth. Because that happened time and time again, and it's absolutely invaluable. And again, I highly encourage people to both seek that out and seek out younger musicians that you can do that for. Um, but there was a local musician who I always thought was phenomenal. Uh, who had said, "Have you ever heard of the Gospel Music Workshop of America?" And I said, "No." He said, "I'm going to take you." And that year was in Detroit, and he took me to the Gospel Music Workshop of America in Detroit. And up by this point, I'd been playing for this Church of God in Christ for a while. I'd been going back and forth to the church in Chicago that my godmother was involved in. I'd been playing for the UW Gospel Choir for a while. I thought I was, and I was also doing plenty of other non-gospel music, both Arts on Prevention. I was still doing that. I was starting to get hired by other local bands. I was starting to do very, very, very minor studio work. I thought I was the stuff. And by this point, like I said, I was probably 16 maybe. And he took me to the Gospel Music Workshop of America in Detroit. And I just imagine being in a convention center that seats thousands of people. And all those thousands of people are musicians that can play better than you. And some of them are half your age. It was an absolutely I showed up there like, I'm going to play for everything and I'm going to get hired by everybody and this is going to be so great. By the end of the week, and I even managed to talk my way on stage a couple times and always got kicked off. And by the end of the week, the only place that they would let me play was the piano in the hotel lobby. But it ended up being an invaluable experience for three reasons. First of all, I think every good musician needs that kind of ass kicking at some point in their life, and oftentimes multiple points in your life. You have to realize that there are always people better than you, and you have to be around them. My goal is always to be the worst musician in the room if I can. That's the best way to learn. Second thing was I made connections that week that have helped me to this day. One of the few people there that didn't treat me like shit was Cassandra O'Neill. And I don't know if you know who she is, but if you don't, Google her. She went on to was music director for Macy Gray, Mary J. Blige, toured with Prince for a very long time. Now she teaches at Columbia School of Music in Chicago. I met her when I was that cocky kid showing up like, I'm going to be great. And she treated me like an equal, even though I clearly wasn't. Great friend, great relationship to this day. Melvin Crispell, one of the most famous organists in the world, sadly passed on some years ago. I met him that first year, and he also became a mentor to me. So yeah, that was absolutely an invaluable experience, but it was a very humbling experience because I went back to Wisconsin realizing I am nothing. I got to start over from zero. And it wasn't until I moved out to Wisconsin, and part of it was being by that point in time, I was a big fish in a small pond, and I needed to go to a different pond. And so when I moved out of Wisconsin is when I really started making connections and getting better and really growing. But those are the formative years. So I would say that's from coming home from the hospital to going to that workshop and realizing that in all the learning and growing that I'd done in those 16 or so years, I'd might as well go right back to zero. That's what I would call the formative years of my music childhood.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing, Dan. And I obviously along that journey you met the Hammond organ. Can you just share briefly with us about what was that experience like, and how did you get to grips with it so you could use it in these gospel environments?
That's a different and simultaneous journey because if you watch my YouTube channel, you know I'm also interested in vintage electronics and ceiling fans and lighting and other things. I like how things work, and I like fixing things, and I like stuff like that. And honestly, if I would have known that my YouTube channel was going to be as successful as it has been, I probably would have separated the music from everything else. But sometimes I'm glad I didn't because it's an interesting cornucopia of the things that make up me. So again, the formula of memory with the Hammond organ was seeing Clyde Stubblefield, who had his keyboard player had like a Roland VK7 or some form of digital organ, whatever was available in the 90s, maybe a Korg CX3, plugged into some form of Leslie. And then next time my mom went to the local music store to buy sheet music for her piano students, I wandered off and bugged the guys in the piano and organ department. I said, "What's this spinning speaker?" They said, "Oh, that's a Leslie speaker. It goes to the Hammond organ. We have one over here. You want to see it?" And they showed it to me, but it wasn't hooked up to anything. And I think one of the core things that really helped me was that this was when the internet was first starting to become a thing. So I would take my bike down to the library, and you could sign up to use the library computer for 30 minutes because people didn't have internet in their homes back then. But it was free to use the library computer, so I'd start researching. Then when I got to middle school, one of my music teachers in middle school had some point during his music career, I think maybe his dad owned a piano and organ showroom, so he knew a lot about Hammonds. And so he allowed me to do a research project on the Hammond organ as part of my grade in middle school. And so I would be on his computer during that period just doing research, and there was a Hammond organ listserv, if you guys remember listservs. Back then, where there's a lot of information was available. One of the guys on that listserv gave me my first Hammond organ, which was an M100, which is a pretty small, moderately useless Hammond organ, but still, it's got the same guts as like a B3, C3, A100, the big boys, but smaller. And so that was my first one, and I hooked it up to a little homemade Leslie in my bedroom. And then somebody offered me an M3, which is quite literally the baby B3. So I got that one. I gave somebody else that was a young aspiring musician the M100. And it wasn't until I got to, actually, I don't remember which came first. One of two things happened. One is that I started touring with bands, and so I took one of these organs that somebody gave me, and I chopped it. I made what's called a chop, where you cut the bottom off, which I'd never recommend doing that to B3s and C3, the big boys, because they don't make them anymore. But you can do it to a M3, M100, H100, E100, any of the models that are less desirable make great candidates for chops. So I chopped it, made it so it sit up on legs, so we could take it to these gigs with Arts Are Prevention and some of these other bands that I was doing. So then I had my own organ to gig with. And then the other key thing that happened was when I was playing for that church, the first church that I really played for, and we had just gotten our first building. It was because they started out, because he just planted this church. He started having church in a hotel. And then when he first rented his first building, I just happened to find at an estate sale a full-size Hammond organ and Leslie for $200. And I remember calling up the pastor and being like, we need to get this. And he's like, you need help with the money? I was like, no, I've saved up enough money from my gigs. I just need some help moving it out of here, because it was in the basement of some retired organist that had kept it in his basement. And so that was the first organ that I owned. And I just kept an eye out for years, because this is, classifieds, and then later Craigslist became a thing. And I read up as much as I could. I learned how to work on them as best as I could. Yeah, I still have me and a friend of mine who's an organist and a very good organ tech. We share a space where we've got a couple dozen organs that we work on and play and everything else like that. One of the great things about living in the Midwest is that the Hammond Organ Company was in Chicago, Illinois. So you find they're like weeds here, whereas you go to down south or the East Coast or the West Coast, they're a lot harder to find. And then don't go across the pond.
That's right.
Where, you might, I've been over there exactly once on tour, and I requested an organ. We were in London, and then we were in Italy for a month. And I requested that I would have an organ at every gig, and I had an organ at 0 gigs. So, yes. They're not, so I think I was very lucky that I was here, where everybody's grandma had one in their living room or their den or their basement of a certain generation, because they were made so close to here, and they were, they used to be a staple.
That's right. And don't ever come down under for Hammonds, Dan, because I think I've seen one in my entire lifetime. They're around, but there's not many of them. So just a quick question, with all that wonderful performance, both growing up and then the overseas touring and your current work, have you ever had any on-stage disasters where things have just gone horribly wrong that might amuse our listeners and viewers?
Probably too many to count. Most of the time I try to just not remember it, because I'm one of those guys that still remembers what I did wrong in kindergarten and still keeps me up at night. So I really, really try to forget when things don't go well, especially if it wasn't my fault, which most of the time it probably wasn't. The one that came to mind, and I don't know if you'd call this a disaster or not, but this was the first thing that came to mind. So this would have been in that era when I was still in Arts Art Prevention. I was probably in high school by this point. And I was starting to play for some different churches and gospel events and things around town in southern Wisconsin, here and there in Chicago and stuff like that. And I thought I was really good. And me and the drummer from Arts Art Prevention, would often we were the team that would go to these different, because we really need is organ and drums. The rest of Arts Art Prevention was singers and guitar players and bass players and dancers and horn players and whatever else. But what you really need for church is organ and drums. So me and this drummer's name was also Eric, which is the same as the name of my drummer at church today. Me and this Eric would just go from church to church to church, playing because we loved it. Sometimes they would pay us, sometimes they would feed us. I don't think we were really thinking about that too much. And one of the churches that we had played for before was having an event, and they had a bunch of churches in from out of town. It was some sort of convention or concert or something to that effect. And they were holding it in a community center. And the community center did not have any instruments or any sound equipment. So me and him said, well, no problem. We're with Arts Art Prevention. Arts Art Prevention has all of this equipment. We'll use Arts Art Prevention's equipment. And which Arts Art Prevention was cool with, as long as it didn't interfere with what they were doing, I think we ended up keeping half of it, because I think by this time I could drive, and we ended up either that or he was older and somebody was driving that wasn't the adults. Somebody had a driver's permit or something at this point. And so we would keep the equipment around. And so we were at this community center, and we'd set up all the equipment, and we were playing for the service, and I don't even think we were getting paid. And then some preacher, pastor, something like that from out of town was taking his turn on the mic, and they were raising an offering. And it's somewhat of I don't want to call it a tradition, but so a lot of black church traditions come from slavery. And because Sunday was the one day that the slaves could get away and be safe from danger. And because the slave owners wanted them to be Christian, if they said it was for church, they could stay there all day, which is why historically a lot of black church services are very long, and then you have a lunch in the middle, and then you have an evening service, and there's a lot of black church traditions, and for that matter, a lot of evangelical traditions that are in white evangelical churches, because the white evangelical churches in the U.S. actually branched off of the early black evangelical churches. The founder of my denomination, Bishop C.H. Mason, was arguably one of the first, Pentecostal bishop, and he had some white churches serving under him, and they broke off because they didn't want to serve a black man, and that's kind of the origin story of the Christian right. And so there's some unhealthy traditions in black churches that come from slavery. One of those being is that a pulpit is a safe place that you can pretty much say anything you want. We saw Jeremiah Wright get in trouble for that during the Obama campaign, and that was pretty mild compared to what gets said in a black church pulpit. But that comes from slavery, because church was the only safe space. And so you will get some black preachers that will say some pretty horrible things from the pulpit because it's part of the tradition. And in this particular case, he was raising an offering. He saw we weren't giving anything in the offering, and he got on the mic and he pointed to us and he called us cheap musicians. So he didn't know, I guess, I don't know if he knew we were kids, but we looked like kids probably, but who knows, that we had brought all the equipment for the whole service. And this was a big service. They had churches in from all out of town. So me and the drummer looked at each other and said, I guess we're cheap musicians. And we packed up all of the sound equipment and all of the instruments in the middle of service and left them with nothing.
That is truly unique, Dan. That is brilliant.
So I don't know if that counts as a disaster, but
that's brilliant.
That was my strongest memory. I've had a lot of the more common ones, like you're about to take your big solo and the backline guitar amp stops working, or, one time when I was on tour in Italy, and the drummer was asking for more loop in her monitor, and the engineer just said no. It's like, just no. Like, how? That more of that kind of stuff. If it's happened to me, I don't recall the kind of stuff that you hear about where like somebody's rig collapses on stage or something like that. But definitely had lots of situations like that where one way or another somebody said something on the mic that was untoward, and directed towards the musicians, whether it was our fault or not. And that definitely is the example that sticks out in my mind of that to me.
Yeah, as David said, a very unique example, and certainly a train wreck or a disaster for the pastor who you left to his own devices. So thank you for sharing.
Well, and he
Uh,
wasn't even the pastor over the conference. He was one of the guest speakers. But, we were young and ignorant. We didn't know any better. We were just like, well, F him then, you know. And I'm sure that there were people from the host church that were begging us to stay, but he'd already insulted us. What you going to do? We're here for free. We brought you all your sound equipment. Don't insult us.
I wish I'd been
So,
there to see it. I wish I'd been there to see
yeah,
it.
that would have been back in the
Um,
90s.
so Dan, you foreshadowed it before. We love to ask our guests to name 5 albums that they couldn't live without if they were stranded on a desert island, and you mentioned those 2 formative ones being 1999 and Born in the USA for slightly different reasons. But we're really
Yeah.
interested in what would be your 5 recommended albums.
Well, I hadn't thought about it in terms of recommended albums. I'm just going to mention some albums that have been impactful for me, and we might have to narrow it down to 5. Maybe we'll pick out the ones that are more recommended. I think I mentioned Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. That was a
Hmm.
very early one for me because my mom wanted me to take piano lessons. I didn't want to take piano lessons, and so one of the things she tried before she gave up was sending me to a jazz piano teacher. And the jazz piano teacher was very nice, but was not in any way interested in the stuff that I wanted to learn. I didn't want to learn how to be a pianist. I wanted to learn how to be a gigging musician that played guitar and maybe organ for bands and maybe churches at this point and stuff like that. And that teacher gave me Herbie Hancock's Headhunters and said, I bet this will resonate with you. And she was right. And to this day, that's the album. Anytime I get a new stereo system or new sound system, new studio monitors, anything, that's the album that I put in to test the new speakers. So to me, that's a very formulative album. Around the same time, it might have been through her, it might have been through my dad, it might have been through somebody else. I discovered Stevie Wonder's Talking Book, which is how I became um, a fan of Stevie Wonder, and how he became an early influence on mine. But honestly, if you're going to pick one Stevie Wonder album, I think you have to pick Songs in the Key of Life because that is the quintessential Stevie Wonder record. There are very few skips on that record whatsoever. Um, the other really formulative album for me in terms of my learning music was when I first started with Arts Art Prevention, and we first started getting hired to do, in addition to because Arts Art Prevention was doing like R&B and funk. We were doing lots of James Brown covers, lots of Temptations covers, that kind of stuff. Commodores, and when we first started getting involved in gospel music, the only person who'd played gospel music before amongst all the kid musicians was the drummer, and the rest of us had never played gospel before. And I understood black music at this point, but I didn't understand gospel. And they would try to play me stuff, Ricky Dillard and James Cleveland and whoever, and it just didn't click with me. And then somebody pulled out the God's Property record by Kirk Franklin, and it just everything made sense. And once I heard that record, I was like, I get it now. And I've gone out of my way to personally thank everybody involved in that record, not just Kirk Franklin, but Robert Sput Seawright, who's now the drummer for Toto, was very heavily involved in that record. His mom was actually the choir director for God's Property. Sean Martin from Snarky Puppy was one of the keyboard players, producers on. I mean, these guys are friends of mine to this day, and that's because as soon as I started to get connections in gospel music, I sought them out to thank them for that record, because that record really was a life-changing record. But I have to pick my favorite Prince records, because ultimately Prince is my hero. He is my favorite musician. He's my favorite anything. I love Prince, and I would say, to me, the 2 albums that any musician needs to listen to from Prince would be the Love Symbol album and Musicology. But not Musicology, excuse me, Rainbow Children. And those are not like the first choices, I think, of a lot of people, which is part of why I picked them, because they don't have as many of the known songs. But they're also, I keep saying Musicology. Rainbow Children was the Prince really, really stretching out as a musician. Like, y'all don't think I can play every instrument like with the same virtuosity that Miles Davis and Stevie Wonder can play. Watch this. It wasn't him doing the simple poppy stuff for his hits. This was him stretching out as a jazz musician, but also keeping it funky. That is a lot of musicians' favorite Prince album, and it doesn't get talked about enough. And then the Love Symbol album, it has 3 or 4 of my favorite Prince songs back to back, which is "Sexy Motherfucker," "To the Nines," and "Morning Papers." And not only does it have, those are 3 of my favorite Prince songs, but they're in a row and they're in the appropriate order to like listen to those songs. And so I honestly can't pick a better Prince record than that. And of course, my good friend and one of my other musical heroes, Michael Bland, was the drummer on that album. The other thing I would put is my favorite gospel artist is probably Fred Hammond. And I was trying to narrow it down earlier to think about, because he's got a lot of great albums, and then he's made some of them into DVDs. And there's Pages of Life 1, Pages of Life 2, the Pages of Life DVD. Then there's the Pages of Life 3 DVD. And then there's the Purpose by Design DVD. And if we're allowed to include DVDs, I'd say that Pages of Life 3 DVD concert is probably my favorite example of recorded gospel music. But any of those albums by Fred Hammond will qualify. And the DVD versions are available on YouTube, although it's a little chopped up and the audio quality isn't great. But I know that's more than 5.
No, that's okay, but that's okay. They're great picks, Dan, and we'll definitely list them all. I think that's a great diverse pick, and I think that diversity sort of is a testament to your own career to date, as far as just how diverse from a very young age and your willingness to learn new things and get involved in stuff. And I mean, unfortunately, we've got to wrap it up there, but I cannot thank you enough for even giving us this glimpse into your career. As I said, it's been fascinating over the last 3 or 4 years to watch your work, and I can only see it going from strength to strength, and would love to catch up again in the future and see how things are going with you.
Absolutely. I would love to come back.
And there we go, Paul. I had a ball. I think that was one of the more interesting, like, historical views on an approach to music. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, Dan was as you all heard, he was great, very generous with his knowledge, and I found that quite educational. I really enjoyed listening to Dan's insights.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for those, we'll definitely be linking to Dan's YouTube channel in the show notes. He did mention, for example, he likes to fix things. If I'd had more time, Dan has multiple videos, for example, on vintage ceiling fans, and you'll see that he had a vintage ceiling fan above him in during the interview. He's got some interesting pastimes, but one consistent message is he's passionate about it, and he always delivers high quality work. And can't thank Dan enough for taking part. So, yeah, look, we better keep running, but Paul, actually, we'll start. We've got another great band T-shirt to talk about.
Yeah, so I've got this one here, the Not Know Hows, and I always play this game when I get these shirts. I think, what kind of music do you reckon this band does? And I've got to tell you, I got this one completely wrong. So the punk band, punk band out of Canada, very stripped back. Noreen, the lead singer, and look, this is 3 times in a row. I think I've featured a band who've got a female lead singer or female, and that's by pure coincidence. So I'm not an activist or anything, but it's great. There should be more women in music. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
And the rock music scene I have it's far too male. So
absolutely,
go to girls, I reckon. But yeah, so great music. It's punk. It's stripped back. If you like that sort of thing, think like I don't know, that real Ramones, real stripped back type style. And Noreen also plays a little bit of keyboard too, so that's fantastic.
Nice.
So there you go. The Not Know Hows.
Excellent. The Not Know Hows. Great to have you on board, team. And speaking of people we love having on board, we'll just quick shout out to our sponsors. I'm going to start this time with Brother Paul Brown from the Waterboys. I just stumbled across, literally last night, a full concert video of the Waterboys in action about 2 months back. Yeah, just wow. I could watch those guys all day, and I can see, aside from his virtuosic, that's the word, playing skills, it's just his energy on stage. I can see why Mike Scott has Brother Paul in that band for many, many reasons. So thank you, Brother Paul, for your ongoing support. And the same applies to the wonderful Tammy Catcher from Tammy's Musical Stew, who's been a long-term supporter of the show. Again, thank you, Tammy. Couldn't do it without you. And then the musicplayer.com forums, we'd be lost without them as well. They're our home from the get-go, and do recommend them for any keyboard player that wants to jump into some fascinating discussions around keyboard synths, you name it, the approach to playing and so on. So they're our three supporters for this show. Otherwise, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. This, when it goes to air, will be 9 episodes after this one till we hit number 100, Paul.
Oh, my goodness, 100. We can raise the bat.
That's we can.
Cricket reference for our American followers.
That's right. So maybe we'll have a cricketer on for the 100th episode just to mix things up.
Yeah, let's do that.
So, we'll be back in a week or two. Can't thank you all enough for your time. We love hearing from you. As always, editor@keyboardchronicles.com. We're on Facebook, TikTok, Threads, Instagram, all under the Keyboard Chronicles. You can find us there. But if we don't hear from you, then we'll speak to you next episode.